No matter what your level of skill in Keyshot is, a solid understanding of composition will always help you to make a more compelling image. Before we get into the weeds, it's important to know that different products are going to have different appropriate compositions because different products have different communication goals. Because of that, the techniques I'm talking about will be more like guidelines to help you be a better visual storyteller as opposed to fast and hard rules on how to compose your image. The first thing you need to be able to do within your composition is establish a focal point. There are a lot of different ways you can do this. Things like form, color, texture, things that are generally used within painting are all applicable within Keyshot too. Additionally, you can use the depth of field tool within your camera settings to create a focal point by putting an element in focus against the rest of your composition. This is called establishing a hierarchy of detail, which is an important part of making your renderings feel less flat and managing the pieces of your rendering altogether. Depth of field will also help you establish a foreground, middle ground, and background, which is a good way of embedding your product into a context or an environment that you build out within Keyshot. Another more photographic way of establishing a focal point is through use of lighting. By playing lighting onto the specific element that you want to highlight, you can increase the value of that against a duller background and push that to the forefront of what people are looking at. Also, using layout within the Keyshot scene and camera angles to find naturally occurring lines that direct the eye to a focal point can be a good way of reinforcing any other techniques that you might be using on top of that. Sometimes when trying to establish a connection between two or more objects, it can be appropriate to create multiple focal points. But you just want to make sure that you're establishing a hierarchy between them to not crowd your render or confuse the viewer as to what the actual point of what you're doing is. Okay, so you can guide the viewer to the focus of your render, but now where do you put that focus? And what's the relationship it should have to the other components of your render? Depending on what your goals are, you'll be pushing your composition in either dynamic or static range. Things like the rule of thirds and the golden ratio are good ways of managing the space on your render and understanding placement and balance. It's important to make sure that you're not crowding anything and you're taking, the visual weight of objects within your render into account. Sometimes you want to push the balance way off to be dramatic, or sometimes you want to keep things pretty, neat. Basically, if you're not intentionally doing so, don't crowd any one area of the render, and also manage your negative space effectively. All this stuff is relatively basic, but sometimes there are opportunities to push your render a little bit farther. When appropriate, sometimes changing the aspect ratio of your rendering can emphasize form or create tension and drama within the image more effectively than just, your average renderings would. Also, lighting can be used to add more to your rendering besides just emphasizing the focal point. For instance, here we have a rendering. It's pretty static, it's not bad, but let's say I wanted to add a little bit of drama. Then the lighting has introduced a subtle dynamism to the otherwise static image and also activated some of the negative space surrounding the focal point. It's not interrupting the flow of the image as intended, but it's definitely adding a little bit more visual interest. All in all, no matter how well you can use Keyshot, it's always going to be more effective to compose your images with intent as opposed to, just kind of going in and doing whatever. It helps to remember that everything that appears within your image is an element of the composition, whether you intended it or not. So managing everything intentionally will, elevate your renders to a level that's almost painterly sometimes. If you're struggling to visualize your composition, it can be helpful to sketch things out beforehand and also, clearly understand the goals of what you're trying to communicate and how all the separate elements within an image might help reinforce those goals. Obviously, there's a lot of depth to storytelling and composition, and I've really only scratched the surface here. So I would encourage you to look into more of it on your own, take inspiration from photography, painting, filmmaking, any of that. And it's totally possible that you'll stumble upon a cool technique that's unique to the product that you're trying to depict. If you want any more information on this or any future topics, message me or Kyle. Otherwise, I hope this video helped you a little bit, and good luck out there.